The presentation I'm going to give actually will follow the guidance of Hal's initial presentation. I'm going to be asking maybe some unpopular questions. So that's all with good intentions, all right? So let's proceed. I want to talk about understanding strategy. If you don't understand strategy, I mean, implementation is kind of, shall we say, academic. So think of the way to think about strategy, the challenge is like kind of like Homer Simpson thinking about atoms and elementary particles. Everything is overwhelming. There's too much. So what have scientists done in the case of trying to help somebody like Homer Simpson or Homer Victor Tang about strategy? Well, the simplest thing you do, actually, is you organize the material, right? The Russian chemists developed the periodic table. So you organize all this complexity into a structure. Elementary particles, what happens? I had the good fortune of actually discussing elementary particles with 3 Nobel Prize winners. And what they said was the elementary particles was like a zoo. You had giraffes, you have cows, you have rabbits, and you have tigers. And they said, how do we organize all this? And what they did is they created an organization for elementary particles that you see here, right? Heavy particles, intermediate, and light particles, right? And everything is organized into the standard model. Everyone that worked here got the Nobel Prize, including a whole bunch of them from MIT. So the idea of strategy, I think we have to organize the literature that we read about strategy. Here are some examples. It's overwhelming, right? In German, in Japanese, in Chinese, in English. I look at strategy, and the number of Google searches ranges 348 million. You look at Google Scholar on strategy, close to 6 million. Holy smokes. I look at this and I'm saying, boy, I'm Homer Simpson, multiply it by 10 to the minus 12, right? So how do we organize strategy? This is Vic Tang's theory. Strategy is made up of 4 strengths which are woven together and form the body of knowledge of strategy. The 4 strengths are as follows: normative, descriptive, prescriptive, and declarative. Let's go to the first one, normative. If we want strategy implementation to really be effective, we need to turn strategy into a science. Not a natural science, but a social technical science. And so when you talk about a science, whether it's natural science or social technical science, the first question is, what are the first principles? And if you cannot talk about first principles in strategy, you don't know what you're talking about. Because it then becomes storytelling, and this is what I believe and this is what I think. So normative principles are fundamental. And Vic Tang is in the search of finding normative principles. Second, descriptive literature. What is the descriptive literature? With my apologies to the people that just spoke before us, they were fundamentally descriptive. There were stories of cases that they thought was interesting and successful, and there were lessons that we can derive from them. What's wrong with descriptive stories? It's nothing wrong, it's good. But what you have to do really is search for what are the first principles that are revealed in these descriptions that we can generalize for the overall practice of strategy and implementation? So the absence of first principles, then it becomes another story. Then we get into what I call, in what I would call prescriptive literature. The prescriptive literature is are the practices and the theories of strategy implementation that are based on rigorous academic approach. What is most important about prescriptive literature is based on first principles, and they are repeatable and reproducible. The methods in the prescriptive literature. And you know the difference between reproducible and repeatable, right? So I won't go into that. If you don't know, catch me during the break. Finally, the most interesting is what I call the declarative literature. What are the declarative literatures? The declarative literature is mostly written by people I call hippos. What is a hippo? A hippo is the highest income person in the organization, HIPPO. So hippos was in an organization would say, this is the strategy and this is what we're going to implement. So what's the normative principle in that? I'm the highest paid person. Therefore, you're going to listen to me. Now, there's a problem with hippo. There are two types of hippos. There's hippos like in Dilbert, right? Who says, you're going to do this and you're going to follow my orders. With apologies to my German friends, this is what is called the Achtung method. You go to Germany and you see signs, road signs says Achtung. And that means you better pay attention because this is a rule and you better follow it, right? But there are other hippos which are fundamentally people that fundamentally change strategy and the way the world works because they're inspired. So the other type of hippos are the highly inspired person in the organization. Example, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, with my apologies to my German and Japanese friends, okay? He said, how we're gonna win the war, World War. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had never won a world war in his life. Neither did he want that mission. But he said very simply, the way we're gonna win it is we're gonna take on Germany first, the Nazis, not the Germans, okay? We're gonna take on the Nazis first, and then after we defeat the Nazis, we're gonna take on the militarists in Japan. That was the strategy. It was declared. It was inspired, right? So those are the two types of declarative literature. This is a table which I hope you cannot read because it's in the paper, but what I've done is really segmented the literature into the 4 types along 8 dimensions. So this cell has 32 entries that describe the 4 types of strategy literature. So I think we really should try to understand the strategy literature along these lines with this kind of degree of precision. I'm not saying this is good or this is perfect or even that it is moderately good, but I'm saying that this provides at least a framework which all of us should try to refine and improve to really provide a more sound foundation and basis for strategy. So read my paper. So what are we doing? One of the things that we're doing is Eric has initiated a curated database of literature of strategies. And we're collecting strategy documentations. There are descriptive, prescriptive, and declarative. And out of that collection, we hope to be able to distill new knowledge, which we can go back and refine the normative principles and really improve the science of strategy. That's it.
I get extra for me? Oh, no, I haven't. Right, so, apologies, because I've got an absurd amount of material, because I wrote the presentation before I realised there was only 15 minutes, so I'm just going to go like a train, and apologies for galloping through it. So what I want to talk about is a systemic approach to strategy that my colleague and I, Lucy Lowe, I'm Patrick Hoverstadt, by the way, you can tell I'm not Lucy Lowe because I've got a beard, have developed, and how that applies to the execution gap. So we're consultants primarily, play at being academics, so I do a bit of work at Cranfield and one or two other business schools, but primarily this is from practice. So in terms of practice, what we do in consultancy is strategy, organisation, and change. So the issue about how those bind together is absolutely fundamental for us. This is not a nice to have, this is life and death from a business point of view for us. And we do it from public sector, private sector, third sector. So primarily what I'm talking about is an approach, and to pick up your point, it's both normative and prescriptive, I would argue. The to execution part, though, is from experience. So it's the experience of having used this with 60 or 70 different organisations. I'm going to start with the sort of slightly horrific statistics that we get on the failure of strategy. So they vary, and what defined as failure varies, but none of them are particularly attractive. The worst result I got was from Rusakov at 98% failure rate. And you look at that and you go, well, there's something pretty fundamentally wrong here. I would argue that patterns of strategy, the approach I'm talking about, helps with that in three quite distinct ways. So the first one is the hardest to get your head around. And if you walk away with nothing else, try and get your head around this one. A lot of the stuff that I read in this field of the translation of strategy into execution basically starts from the assumption that strategy is okay and the problem is execution. Yeah. And we would argue that looked at systemically, this is fundamentally flawed. There is a lot about conventional strategy that simply doesn't make sense from a systems point of view. And looked at systemically, we would argue we would expect it to fail about as often as we see it failing. So no surprises there, except it apparently is to conventional strategists. The second one is much simpler. It's around the speed at which you can go through the strategy execution cycle. And the faster, we argue, the faster you can do that, the better it is. And patterns of strategy helps you with that. And the third one is around breaking strategy down into a series of manoeuvres, which makes it just much, much more manageable. So the first one is kind of the key one, really. The other two are quite easy. Looked at comparing a systemic approach to a conventional approach, there's some fundamental differences. Probably too many to go through here. But conventional approaches tend to take either a market view, based view, or an organisation view. So you start at one of those two places and then look at how they relate. In systems, of course, we always look at the nature of the relationship. So it gives you a very, very different focus. So what we're looking at is the nature of the strategic fit between market and organisation. So the focus is on the relationship, not on the things. Conventional strategy tends to have a single actor as opposed to multiple actors. Totally ignores time, really, except that gets shuffled off into the execution bit. Predicated on competition, well, yeah, organisations compete, but they also all collaborate. So if you're only focused on competition, you're kind of missing at least half of the picture. And the big one, I think, really is around the Mintzbergian split between deliberate and emergent strategy. So the focus in strategy thinking is around what we want to happen, almost a sort of Cartesian split between mind and reality. Mintzberg's point about what emerges is what emerges is, I think, fundamental to this. And emergence, of course, is a systemic concept. In systems, what we're trying to do is understand how the system drives the emergence that we see. Yeah. So this split in thinking between thinking about strategy as a mental construct versus what actually happens and why that happened is fundamental for us. Whatever approach to conventional strategy you take, there's a kind of dominant narrative, which is the sort of journey thing, which is strategy is about where we are, where we want to get to, and how we get from where we are to where we want to get to. Very, very straightforward. Does have the disadvantage that it ignores pretty much every other strategic player in the space that we're in, and there almost always are other strategic players. So under the impact of them, what tends to happen is that the target shifts through time, and also we end up trying to avoid car crashes. So we start off heading in one direction, we end up heading in somewhere completely different. I was doing the strategy for a business school in the UK. They are going in exactly the opposite direction to the direction they set out on, and nobody noticed. Yeah, so through time, the direction shifts fundamentally and dramatically. And if you think about just driving down the road in the way that people are taught to do strategy conventionally, which is basically ignoring what everybody else is doing, just I want to go there and hoping that everybody else is going to get out of your way, you kind of wouldn't get very far. And if you translate that back into organisational world, it's not surprising they don't get very far either without crashing. Yeah. So for us, there's an interesting question, which is this one. So I mean, if the failure rate is as high as reported, and the 90% figure is Kaplan and Norton, who are about as conventional as you can get, really, you can do the, oh, that's a pity, isn't it? But for us, there was a much more fundamental question, which is, what is going on? Because organisations and businesses are changing all the time. And if it's not the strategy that's driving that, and it can't because that's not what's being implemented, what is driving it? Yeah, because that equation of it's not the fault of strategy, it's the fault of execution, patently falls down because change is happening because change is being executed all the time. Yeah, it isn't on the execution, primarily on the execution side. So the question for me was, what's driving the changes? And to answer that, we did what we quite often do in our area of systems, which is go back to biological models. And this is from the Chilean biologist Humberto Maturana, who was interested in what's the actual driver of biological evolution. And his model's called structural coupling. And it's the very, very simple idea that an organism is coupled to its environment in such a way that the organism changes the environment structurally at the same time as the environment changes the organism structurally. So the hummingbird's beak evolves to fit the flower, and the flower evolves to fit the hummingbird's beak. And through time, each affects the other structurally. So transposing that into the world of organisations and into strategy was scarily simple. And to pick up Vic's point, in our experience, universally applicable. So the focus is on the nature of the relationship and the dynamics of that and where that takes us. And structural coupling relationships have a dynamic and a trajectory. We've run this approach with about 60 or 70 organisations. They can always tell what the natural trajectory of their relationships is. So for any organisation, you're sitting in your environment, you've got a number of structural couplings with market, competitor, partners, regulator maybe. And our choices really are to break specific couplings or to alter the couplings that we're in. And from a methodological point of view, what we're doing with patterns of strategy is saying, how do you go about doing that? Each of these couplings exerts a tension, a pull on the organisation, pulling it in particular directions. And what we're arguing is that our overall strategic direction is a compound of that. It's a function of those different tensions. And of course, this is what Mintzberg calls emergent strategy. Yeah, it is the strategy that emerges. The point being that if you understand the systemic forces, you can understand what emergent strategy is likely to be, rather than it just being some weird thing that happens to you. So for us, the purpose of strategy, the meaning of strategy is this. It's around strategic fit. It's about changing our fit with our environment to our advantage by changing power and time. So three critical dimensions, fit, power, and time, and we break that, to be able to sort of work with that, we break that down into a number of elements that we work through. So 3 of fit, 2 of power, and 1 of time. I just want to take you through an example. I'm going to apply it to a historic case, and I'm a big fan of Japanese strategy, so we're going to apply it to a Japanese case. So this is the Honda-Yamaha motorbike war of 81 to 83. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but at the time, Honda and Yamaha pretty much balanced in terms of power, perfectly matched in terms of their concentration of power. So each had about 60 models. They were matched bike for bike, segment for segment, niche for niche, absolutely perfectly opposed. Neither was particularly, it's a very symmetric relationship, neither was particularly driving change asymmetrically in the other. All the change was incremental, it wasn't particularly disruptive or radical at this point, and the industry was perfectly synchronized. So things happened regularly on clockwork, new models came out, roughly 10 a year. At the time, Honda was seen as leading edge and Yamaha as being back in the herd, along with Suzuki and Kawasaki. At the time, Honda were investing heavily in cars, and Yamaha saw this as an opportunity to take control of the bike market. And their strategy looked like this. Started with critical mass. They built the world's biggest motorbike factory. They calculated that would move them from balanced in power to stronger and push Honda back into being weaker, which would move them to be able to shape the relationship, push Honda back into reacting, and that would move them to the leading edge and stuff Honda back into the herd. That was the Yamaha plan. Didn't quite work like that. So the Honda riposte, of course, they can't go match them muscle for muscle because all the war chest is being taken up with the car investment. So the order came down from the Kairetsu, you've got to win this and you've got to win it without any extra money, go to it. So it starts with foresight. You cannot build the world's biggest motorbike factory without it being spotted. So they waited for Yamaha to start building and investing in their factory and waited till all their resources, all their management attention were taken up with that. At the same time, they massively reduced the cycle time it would take them to design, develop and bring to market new bikes and restructured into many more multidisciplinary product teams that could do exactly that. The combo meant that they were much faster at change, which pushed them into being faster and Yamaha into being slower. And then they moved from multiple concentration to diffuse. So from 60 models, they brought out an astonishing 113 models in 18 months. Yeah. So they took every market segment that Yamaha had bike in and split it in half. So the number of 113 is not an accident. It's take a section, split it into two. They did that by changing the paradigm of the industry. So they moved to from a buyer's market based on power bands, so you'd buy a 750, for example, to one based on styling. So they designed bikes for particular tribes of bikers, and they did that deliberately to confound Yamaha. That moved them into shaping, push Yamaha back into reacting. So at the same time as they're trying to bring their big factory on stream, they had to bring out new models, 37 in the 18-month period, but of course it didn't rack up against the 113. And at the end of 18 months, Yamaha were left with 12 months worth of unsold and unsaleable stock, and that was game over. So that gives you a feel for it as an approach and how it unfolds as a dynamic between two actors. The second way I think that patterns help is with Cadence. It is a dramatically faster way of doing strategy. So we did some work with a financial organization. They've been working with one of the big four consultancies on their strategy for 18 months and reckon they got further and deeper in 3 hours with this than they had in 18 months working with one of the big four. Yeah. Being faster at the decision action cycle, I think, has fundamental advantages. It gives you instant competitive advantage. Critically, from an execution point of view, it means that you can execute the strategy. There's less chance that the world is going to shift around you and the strategy is going to become redundant and have to be changed. Yeah? It makes doing options and assessing options and multiple scenarios very, very, very much cheaper and very, very much easier to do. We've got a catalogue of 80 to 100 strategies that we've seen using this approach and documented using this approach. We were able to use that to do an options generation for an organisation, IT client of ours, and we produced 25 viable strategies in an hour and a half. Yeah. Simply by running through the catalogue and saying yes, no. And I think with the Honda Yamaha example, you see how in some situations the speed of strategy is absolutely fundamental. It can be a life and death issue. In terms of actually translating into execution, breaking it down maneuver by maneuver makes it way easier to be really specific about which bits of the organisation need to change and which bits stay stable. So which capabilities are involved in doing this particular manoeuvre and what are the metrics for it. So you can chart whether the strategy is working the way it's supposed to be working as you go through it. and also outcome metrics. Has it had the strategic effect you wanted, yes or no? Yeah. So much, much easier to do that. So gone through that really. It helps you to be much more specific, doing it maneuver by maneuver as to what needs to be done, whether it's working and whether it's happening. So 3 issues really. For me, the big one is unless we understand how emergent strategy emerges, deliberate strategy is going to continue to fail most of the time, and then the whole question of execution is kind of irrelevant, yeah, because it's all going to shift. Strategy cadence makes it much more realistic the strategy is going to be carried out before the world changes on you, and doing it by maneuver makes it much easier to get a grip of. Okay? More or less on time?
Very good.
You happy?
I'm very happy.
Super. Thank you very much.
Good morning. My name is Tyson Browning. I'm from TCU, Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, Texas. And I'm going to be talking about something called the Project Value, Risk, and Opportunity Framework as a way to frame strategy implementation as projects. This is something that I think many of you would see as a natural thing, but I'm not sure in the world of strategy there's this direct connection often made between strategy implementation and project management, for example. I think these 2 fields are largely disconnected and unaware of each other for the most part. And then furthermore, I think project management has not answered all the questions it needs to answer as far as making implementations of any projects successful. And so I'm going to talk about a method that kind of flips on its head the common notion of progress in projects. And instead of looking at progress as doing work, it looks at progress as removing the threats to the project's ultimate desired value. So kind of like a sculptor chipping away at what you don't want, it takes a different view of project progress. So this is just a few bits of overview from what is actually a full day's worth of material. So a great condensation, you'll get the very tip of the iceberg, and I can point you to the paper for this conference and several of the references in that for the details. Even with that, there's going to be a little more technical content here than we've seen in the presentation so far. So maybe some of you will welcome that. I don't think I actually put in an equation, but if you go to the papers, you can find some. So, like I mentioned, viewing strategy as implementation of projects. So there's some assumptions here that this is a reasonable characterization, operationalization of strategy implementation. I think it's often true. There's possibly exceptions we could find, so we'll keep that in mind. And then kind of an implicit assumption in what I'll show you as examples today is that the strategy is good. We know that that's not always true. And that the strategic goal or destination we're going for is fixed. But of course, that's not true either. And so I think those dynamics can be added into what I'll present, but I'm just going to start with that baseline here in the short time we have. So at their beginning, here's the key idea. All projects face some uncertainties, and some of those uncertainties threaten the ability of the project to achieve its desired value. Some uncertainties actually may help. There's an upside to uncertainty as well. We call those opportunities. And then many uncertainties are just inconsequential to our particular goals at the time. And so we treat those separately. So now, though, we're especially interested in the risks, the subset of uncertainties that threaten our ability to implement our strategy or achieve our strategic goals. So I'm going to skip through this. I think we could come up with many examples and go straight to this idea of project risk versus market risk. And so on the diagram on the right, there's something called the goal value of a project. So we are here assuming we can design a project by setting certain goals for certain value attributes of that project. So if we make those goals more challenging, more difficult, if we raise the bar over there, then the risk to our project will grow, all else being equal. Whereas if we make those goals easier to attain, less challenging, and lower that bar, we increase the risk that the market, broadly speaking, and this could be any stakeholders, will be dissatisfied, will not get the desired value. And so there's this trade-off here. We can take more of the risk on inside our project, or we can externalize that risk to perhaps the project's success will not equal our desired value. So we want to keep that distinction in mind here. So setting the goals for strategy implementation or choosing a destination for a strategy is an important consideration. And if we are not aspirational enough, we may find it easy to accomplish the wrong thing. If we're too aspirational, we may find more of the risk inside projects. And in actuality, most organizations have a mix of projects going for various levels of challenge or risk. And so a mistake that's then made sometimes is to treat those projects the same, try to manage them in a similar way, or to try to judge their project managers by the same standards. When some are going for high risk, hopefully also high reward projects, others may be more incremental, low risk, lower payoff projects. So we can take that into consideration here as we ask this question, where to set the bar. So the analogy of a jumper at a track meet, maybe the Olympics, comes to mind here. So where is the bar set? What's the project's goal value that we've chosen? And then the question is, how good a jumper are we? What are our capabilities? There's some distribution of potential outcomes that the project will achieve. Well, there's some value that we would get by meeting those goals for the project, and then there's maybe some additional value that the market might want, but we're not really going after for whatever reason. We've chosen to set our goals perhaps at something less than that. And that's typical. I mean, it's really impossible to capture every possible value out there. So we have to be realistic. But even so, some portion of that project's goal value is going to be at risk because of the uncertainty in our ability as a jumper. So some of those potential outcomes are below the bar. I mean, if we could just rank jumpers by their average success and be satisfied with that, we wouldn't even need a competition. But the fact is that there's good days, there's bad days, there's good jumps and bad jumps, there are good projects and bad projects. And so projects face risk that they won't achieve their goal value. Some of their value is at risk. And I don't want to confuse this with the finance definition of value at risk, but I think there's an analog in the world of projects, that some of a portion's project value is put at risk by the threatening uncertainties that it won't achieve its goals. There's also an upside here. Unlike in a track meet where getting over the bar by any amount is just treated equally, here the possibility might exist that exceeding the bar still allows us to capture some of that additional value. So there's some value perhaps at opportunity as well as at risk, given our abilities as a jumper, given our uncertainty in that. So this PVRO framework is too complex to explain well in a short time. So I'm going to give it a go on one slide. And that's probably a little optimistic here. But the idea is that we pick several value attributes for our project, typically 5 to 10 max. So what are the top level most important characteristics or attributes of the project that determine its overall value to stakeholders? And for each of those, we try to take the best market information we can get to get value functions to inform us about the trade-offs. As we, on the x-axis here, change the outcome of our project, what's the implication for the amount of value provided? And we'll have several of those. Here's 3 more. The project in the paper example has 6. And then to complement each of those, we want to look at how good we are as a jumper. What's the distribution of outcomes for our project based on its capabilities, based on the resources we're putting in, and technologies we're using, and so on. And so we look at these, and again, same x-axis as the value functions. What's the probability that we'll get a certain outcome? And we could use triangle distributions, normal distributions, whatever probability distributions make sense, given the information we have. And then we set goals for each of these value attributes, set the bar at some level. And so this, looking at the value provided by each of those goals, gives us our goal value for the project. And then comparing that with how good we are as a jumper, we can look at what portion of our value is at risk, what portion's at opportunity as well. And so we do this for each individual project value attribute, but if we have some way to then look at them collectively to determine the project's overall value, and there's various models we could use to do this, like weighted average, for example. So that could give us a project goal value and overall project value at risk and opportunity numbers. And then we can look at this in the planning stage and say, okay, most of the risk in our project, or most of the opportunity in our project, it's coming from which particular value attributes? And is it more because of where we've set the goal, or is it more because of our capabilities as a jumper? And then we might choose to adjust those. We might choose to design the project slightly differently, to go for more risk, or to back off on the risk, or to trade off the risks among the various value attributes in a different way, or maybe go after some of the opportunity that seems to be on the table. And then once we've begun the project, we can track and monitor our progress in a little different way. We're asking the question, as we do work, we're creating hopefully useful information that revises our idea of our project outcomes. So this uncertainty in these project capability distributions in the lower left is going to shift. It's going to be revised. It's going to be updated. And so we can adjust those as we go through the project and look at its implications for risk, opportunity, and so on, either for individual value attributes and for the project as a whole, as a composite of those value attributes. And the idea is hopefully that the project makes progress by eliminating the risks of adverse outcomes. And this is a little different way of looking at progress in projects. It's saying that projects begin with uncertainty, some of their value being put at risk, being threatened by consequential uncertainties. But by the end of the project, we hope to have actual value. We hope to replace potential value with actual value. But the work we do and when we do it in projects is the key to making that happen. And so as a project unfolds, it matters when we do certain activities. And rather than asking what's the value added by an activity, we try to answer what's the value provided by its result in terms of reducing risk, of reducing the chance that we won't get the value we want from the project at the end. So removing anti-value versus adding value is a way to think of this. And this really gets back to 2 ways we can think about uncertainty. We could think about some point now in the project, and we're trying to predict its eventual value at the end of the project to us. And there's, of course, a wide range of the way things could turn out. But this takes a slightly different perspective. It says that now is the point when we know the least about the project's outcome. But the point of the work we're about to do is to decrease that uncertainty and get us to a point of actual value. And if we do things up front load the big uncertainty and risk reductions, then we've got a better chance of getting to that desired point sooner rather than later. We'd love a trajectory that's going to decrease the biggest risks quickly, a fail-fast strategy, if you will. And this shows up in many cases. The papers talk more about these, and since I'm about out of time, I'm going to skip through. But the idea here is that as the project moves on, our ability to predict its final outcome is going to get better and better. And being at TCU, football's a big deal. And I love the ESPN app. I don't know if any of you follow this, but it's interesting. Somehow they're able to look at each play run in an American football game and say it's got some effect on the probability of one team or the other winning. So a simple little running play at the beginning may not make much difference, but that same play at the very end, when time's almost up and it's using up the clock in the game, makes a huge difference. And so the same idea with project activities, the value they provide can vary depending on when they occur. So this is a bigger example of that tracking, but in the interest of time, I'm going to refer you to the paper for that. So let me close with a couple quick things. A project we might think of as the finite work done to eliminate the risk of not achieving its goals. That's kind of a double negative definition of what a project might be. But I think it's a useful perspective. It helps avoid some of the common problems and syndromes in projects where everything looks good until suddenly it looks bad. Here, you're basically forced to look bad until you can prove you're not, till you can prove that you've burned down the big risks that stand between you and where you want to be at the end of the project. So I think this has hopeful possibilities for closing the strategy implementation gap. I think not all the terminology perhaps has yet been translated well, but I think it would be interesting to apply this to some cases in the strategy implementation world and see what we find. Thank you.
Dr. Tang's son, could you please report to the front of the room? And there's some microphones here as well.
Where do you want to sit, sir?
Up to you, please.
You sit.
I'm always the guy in the middle.
By the way, Patrick was too much of a gentleman to plug this, but his Patterns of Strategy is a book that's here that he's done, and please take a chance to look at it. So thank you for bringing that. I have a question, and that's the prerogative of the person standing here. I'm very excited because now in the second session, we're digging in at a different angle. And I heard from all three of you some characterization of phenomena as perhaps able to be seen, whether it's at an axiomatic level, perhaps from Vic, or by looking at maneuvers, looking at the trades that exist over time, I think in the PVRO method. Let me flip our question about strategy to ask you from your point of view, if you went in and observed working teams, and you could not have access to the declarative, that is to whatever stated strategy exists in the firm, do you think that you could detect the strategy as embedded? Could you work backwards to understand how would you detect strategy without understanding the declarative or formalized strategic plan?
I'll start with an example in real life. I keep telling my wife that my strategy is to lose weight and gain my boyish figure when I was 18 years of age. And I said, I'm determined to apply that strategy. And this is what my wife says. She says, that's a beautiful strategy, but your behavior is totally opposite. So how can I tell an organizational strategy? You watch the way it behaves. its behavior is indicative of its strategy.
Thank you. Patrick?
I would add that that's basically what we have to do all the time as researchers. When we go into organizations, we're told a number of things, but our job is often to observe and figure out what's really going on. And, you know, you listen to what people tell you, but they may each have a different perspective. So you may not even get the same stories from the same organizations. And so I completely agree with Vic that strategy implementation is as strategy implementation does. That you really only get the implementation view from the ground. The rest is just rhetoric.
I haven't got a mic, so I'll just shout. Thanks. Yeah, I'd endorse that absolutely, and I think it partly goes back to Hal's talk at the beginning as well. Self-delusion is a wonderful thing, and management teams are brilliant at it. So they wrap themselves in a rhetoric of what they are doing and where they are going, and you've got to look at the reality. I think it doesn't actually have to be retrospective. It's not just you look at the behavior and say, what are they doing? You can predict. I reckon it's a 70 to 80% accurate predictor of what decisions are going to get taken if you look at the information going into the decision. So if you look at the types of information that people are taking into account, what they've got access to, you can pretty much predict the decisions that are going to come out. Not what they'll say, but what they'll do. Yeah. So it's kind of not that hard if you actually look.
We're all part of the matrix, I see. Vic?
My apologies if I'm going to offend you, right? Yeah. Oh, okay, good. Because I'm totally uncouth. All right. You said the information that an organization uses to make decisions. I like to draw a distinction, which I heard throughout this morning, between data, information, knowledge, and intelligence. And it's not only the information that an organization uses, but it's the intelligence with which they apply that information. So I have a paper that has been recently published, and this is a commercial, that differentiates data, information, knowledge, and intelligence. And I feel that decision makers have to be able to draw a distinction between these four to make really valid and effective decisions. Data, basically in my mind, is know what. Information is know why. Knowledge is know how. And intelligence is know when. So a good decision is know what, know why, know how, and know when. So, I believe that everything you said is encapsulated in what I said in a shorthand. So I'm not contradicting you. I'm supporting what you said.
Let me ask, are there any questions from the audience? Let me go here in the front. Yes, please.
Hello, I'm Wen. I'm a student from MIT Sloan Fellows class 2019. My question goes to Patrick. I'm really impressed by your dynamic strategy in the ecosystem. But in practice, how can organizations apply this strategy, especially when it's not a major player or there are no major players in the market? So it's just reacting to what the ecosystem change, or you can predict accurately how your customers, your competitors, everyone will do in the future. Thank you.
So if I've understood your question correctly, part of it is to do with scale, is it? The level of organization? You said when there's no major player?
No major players in the market. I mean, how the organization can apply your theory when it's not a major player, or there are no major players in the market.
Okay, so we've used it for organizations of all scale, from multinationals down to teams. Yeah, I mean, I think the smallest was a 10-person organization that we've used it with, operating with similar-sized organizations and competing or collaborating with organizations of thousands. So it works just fine at any scale. In terms of predictability, it's not deterministic. So you can't do a deterministic prediction of this is, usually you can't do a deterministic prediction of this is definitely going to happen. It's stochastic, so you do this is likely to happen. We have never had a case where a client runs through a modeling exercise and is not able to work out what the most likely trajectory for that structural coupling is going to be, and therefore where they're going to end up if they leave it alone. That's not cast iron, so you have to basically do an equivalent of the PVA thing of what are the likely outcomes of this, and then measure against that. Is it unfolding the way we thought it was unfolding? But it's broadly predictive. Does that answer your question? Or have I missed something?
Yeah, 2 sentences.
Let me make a comment for a second, which is that we've talked about strategy as maneuvers and actions and things we're doing over time, and obviously part of this is reflective of, I think, your question, which is this is in the context of a marketplace and competitors and customers, which itself. So a simple question with respect to the implementation of strategy is a model of strategy something that is itself dynamic, present, continuously interacted with, or is it only expressed through the objectives or the plan? And if I go to PVRO, which Tyson showed, there is a real sense of you have an ongoing, continuous way of interacting between this model of strategy and its dynamics and externalities during the implementation as well. Vic?
I'd like to briefly answer your question, because that's a terrific question, and one which I encountered in the past and dealt successfully, unsuccessfully, and at various times. Suppose that you have a strategy and you feel that there's nobody in the marketplace that you can use as an exemplar to compete against, right? What you do is you create a synthetic competitor. You find 3 or 4 or 2 of that have the qualities, and you build a synthetic competitor, and you say, suppose I had to compete with this entity, which is a combination of these few, what would I do? So that's one way which I've found is useful. The other thing that I found is somewhat useful is regardless of organization size, I think when you're trying to implement a strategy, I think you have to ask 2 fundamental questions, very simple questions. In my experience is, first, what are the variables that I can control? Secondly, what are the variables I cannot control? Now, the variables that you cannot control can be very large, like Fatso Kim decides to go to war. It's a variable you cannot control, all right? But nevertheless, put together, identify the variables you cannot control and configure them into a specific set of uncertainty regimes. You understand what I'm saying? So you create what you've done, if you discretize the uncertainty space into a subset, which is a combination of the uncontrollable variables in a variety of configurations. And that I found to be extremely helpful. And in that sense, your strategy, in a way, is predictable, because you say, if I adopt this strategy, and this is the configuration of the uncontrollable variables, what will happen to my strategy? I found that to be extremely effective exercise to go through with the executives. I'll give you one personal anecdote on this. I was the strategy director at the IBM company. And it became very clear to me that the PC and that open networks were going to be the wave of the future. But at that time, I was like some of your SDM students, a young kid, all right? And what do I tell the senior executive of IBM that in fact is going to happen? When I heard, actually I heard personally, the CEO of IBM, and I was in the meeting, he said the PC is serendipity. It's a market anomaly, an accident. It cannot be taken seriously. So as the director of strategy, how do you tell the whole IBM company that maybe they should rethink their mental model? So what I told them is, I said, assume an industry structure which the PC is pervasive, where communications networks are all open, and assume the companies want to distribute their processing and not put it in a single location. What will happen then to the IBM company? And I asked that question to Europe, to the Asia-Pacific region, to the United States, and to Latin America. And the answer which I got was uniformly said that this is very lethal to the IBM company. And it forced actually the CEO of IBM to rethink what the strategy would be like. So in that sense, it's predictive. It may not be predictive in terms of numeric numbers, but qualitatively, it tells you what is going to be fatal.
Vic, let me, I need to cut you guys off so that we can continue. There was one more question I thought I saw. Was it ML in the background? Could you quickly come to the mic, please? And both question and answer will have to be short.
Oh, thank you. Oh, that'll. Thank you. That helps.
Short question.
A very short question, if you will. I'll just bring the sports metaphor here. So it's always this said, the best legs in the fourth quarter wins games. The question to you is, how could your framework amenable to any Bayesian modeling? Because I saw a lot of OR there, but at least we'll know the priors. And the question is, how do you incorporate the T in your calculating if one were to approach through Bayesian?
So I'll make the answer very short and just refer you to the papers. It's not explicitly Bayesian, but I think it should be more clear there how to make it so. Because you're right, it's essentially an updating approach.
Very good.
Can I do a quick answer? So it partly goes back to the presentation this morning about the keynote this morning. And I was minded of, do you guys know John Boyd? Yeah? OODA loop guy? So part of the OODA loop is looking for mismatch, which is a basic Bayesian concept. So, you know, if you're applying that rigorously to strategy, you have a model of how the world is. You constantly and rigorously look for mismatches between what you observe in the world and your model of the world. And that's how you learn. And that's basic Bayesian technique. And I think it applies to your world. It certainly applies to ours. We're constantly doing that. We have unfolding strategies, and we say, is what we see actually what we expected to see, yes or no? Yeah.
Let me thank you guys and have you, and Vic, you're going to stay up. You're up here next.
Next.
But thank you to Tyson and Patrick. So we're going to move on to the next presentation. Thank you. So now you're going to talk about disease.
Yes.
And then you'll be followed in 10, 15 minutes by George Roth.
Okay. I'm going to be offending everybody once more. And in this case, I'm going to do it with great delight and conviction. I think we're looking at the strategy implementation problem completely wrong. Why? Why do I say that? Listen to everything that has been said up to this point, except me, all right? What we're saying is telling you how to develop the perfect strategy. I'll give you an example. I go to the hospital every week about 3 times to exercise. The physician puts a monitor, glues it to my chest, measures my blood pressure before I go in. A nurse sits in front of a tube and looks at my EKG as I go through my exercise routine. And it gets all recorded into a tape, which my physician, cardiologist, oncologist, and all the others look at. Finally, one day I said to the nurse, to the doctor, I said, you know, the only difference between people that exercise and the people that don't exercise is the people that exercise die healthy. So everybody here is telling you how to develop the perfect strategy. The problem with strategy implementation, I say, is a disease. And I'll use this person in the bed who is dying, and her name is misimplementation. What happens? The patient is in the bed and he's saying, what the hell is the disease I got? How do I get better? For God's sake, give me a pill and cure me. But what happens? The physician on the side is giving her a lecture on what perfect health is. Eat nutritious food, get rest, no stress, exercise, and do all these other good things. It's missing the mark. The mental model of the patient is, get me well. Don't give me another lecture on what perfect health is. So when it comes to strategy implementation gap, I say, I'm here to look at the disease that will cure, hopefully, the strategy implementation problem. I'm not here to tell you how to develop the perfect strategy. How do we begin? I'm a firm believer of first principles. Any implementation is dependent on a social-technical organism structure. What is the most parsimonious representation of any structure, social or technical, is this IDEF0 model. It has inputs, it has controls, it has mechanisms, and it has an output. And the mechanism, the functions, transformation, and constructs that are supposed to do things are stated in implementation neutral form, and the mechanisms are really embody the functions that you want in a specific form. So, inputs, functions, transformation, and constructs. What are those things? Those are resources you need to implement a strategy. What do you call the resources that you need to implement a strategy? You call that capacity. Mechanisms and controls are how it gets done and what are the limits and boundaries about how the thing is going to get done. What do you call that? Capability. Finally, outputs. You want timely and decision outcomes. Timeliness. I call that readiness. So I say very simply, the problem with strategy implementation are deficiencies in capacity, deficiencies in capability, and deficiencies in readiness. Think about it. IBM had incredible capacity. They can build chips, they can build large computers, they can manufacture disks. We have plants in something like 12 countries, 2 in Germany, which I've been to, and so on and so forth. But when it came to the PC revolution, they did not have the capability because they had the wrong mental model. So having capacity is not good enough. You have to have the capability to meet the environment and the situation in which you're going to compete. Thirdly, readiness. What's the biggest disease of readiness? How frequently have you presented to an executive and he or she says, we need more analysis, or we don't have enough data, let's try it again, or hey, that's pretty good, Byron, you did a great job, but let's bring in consultant XYZ to come talk to you and then we'll discuss it. What does all this mean? All this means is they're not ready. Also means, for example, I'm going to offend all my American friends here, right? Of which I am one, American. What's the problem with Iraq? Our troops have been there, 15 years. Do we have capacity? Unlimited capacity. Do we have capability? Unlimited capability. What's the problem? We're not ready. Our tanks were built to fight in the plains of Europe where there's no dust. Windstorms get into the tanks, into the guns in Iraq, and it makes all these weapons inoperable. So we're not ready, which makes the implementation fail. So I say that the implementation gap exists because of deficiencies in capacity, in capability, and in readiness. These are like the 3 legs, proverbial legs of a stool. Capacity, capability, and readiness provides together a stable platform to win the prize of fluent implementations. I believe the implementation should be fluent. Agility is nice, is a new buzzword from consultants. But you notice the lemmings jump off the cliff with a great deal of agility. All right? So I think we need to be a little careful. And then it should be based on first principles, like I said already this morning. So capacity, capabilities, and readiness are first principles, based on first principles, are really the way to close the implementation gap. Example, this is a bank which shall remain nameless. It's a global bank that has hundreds of billions of dollars, and they buy the best equipment, the best network in the world. the buy is so fast that the people don't know how to use a great percentage of the stuff they're getting. So they have tremendous capacity, but very low capability. They want to expand around the world. They send their people to other countries who don't speak the country's language. They employ local people in the banks who don't understand the mentality of the culture and owners of this bank. In other words, they're not ready. They have enormous capacity, they have low capability, and they're not ready. Will this bank succeed in its strategic implementation of a global network? I doubt it. I have an equation. Where's Tyson? Oh, there. I have an equation. The equation, effective capacity divided by capability deficiency within omega multiplier determines effective output, and that is the curve. So these are the ISO curves of output. The yellow curve is high output. The other curves are low output. Say you're in the point of the intersection of the two vectors. If you want better output, but you want to fix capacity, you better develop additional capability. If you are at the same capability, but you want more output, you better get more capacity. It's as simple as that. All right? Simple but complex, because we have to really decompose each of the XY variables, right, to be able to develop this equation. What's the beauty about this equation? The beauty about this equation is that it really begins to capture really the first principles about strategy implementation. In the first place, one equation has all three variables: capacity, capability, and readiness. And then out of this, we find these principles. Capacity, I say, should be measurable as a ratio scale. If you don't know what a ratio scale is, catch me during the break. All things being equal, that's Latin, all right? All things being equal, more capacity can improve output, albeit with diminishing returns. That's consistent with economics. Effective capacity is always measured relative to a worthy competitor. It's not that I say I have good capacity. What you do is you should evaluate your capacity against a worthy competitor. If you don't have one, you build one artificially, a synthetic one, and so on and so forth. So these are first principles that we can derive directly from the assumption and the principle that says capacity, capability, and readiness are the principal determinants of the sickness of the implementation gap. So I'm with Tyson Browning, which says that, hey, forget about the perfect strategy. Find the things that don't work and fix them. And I say, what are the things you fix? 3 things. So this is what I'm doing next.
Thank you. How much time do I have? Take all the time I need. Okay, I stand between you and lunch. You may think Vic is a tough act to follow, but I have the fortunate opportunity of actually being engaged and working with Vic. So we are partners in this MIT strategy implementation research project. This is my presentation. I should be here. Thank you. This is my presentation here to give some insights into thinking about the territory and its implications for what we do for our research, some of which has been implicit in what's been talked about by Vic. So what's in this territory? What's
Middle green button.
It's an unusual slide advancer. And this is part of our effort here really to focus on developing a science of learning tied to strategy implementation. There we go. A bit of a philosophical approach here in terms of what are some of the challenges. And you'll see that I'm going to spend a lot of time talking not about strategy or about implementation, but strategy implementation. What is that specific territory? How do I define that? And what does it relate to? And I draw here in this slide a little bit on some theory that comes from types of complexity. And I would like to just highlight here that we have behavioral complexity, meaning we have different people with different worldviews that are involved, and we have dynamic complexity, which has to do with where results show up, emergence in systems principles. Many of the things that Patrick talked about inform this. And the result is that it's not the kind of problem that we can break down into pieces and decompose, but characteristics that have us look at sets of problems to address how we might do better at strategy implementation. So a big part of this here is that I have a very tame title that says guidelines for getting from strategy to implementation. And what I really need to do is probably get rid of that and recognize that this territory as a wicked mess might be something more like, how do we make the leap from strategy to implementation? And that leap is a chasm. And one of the challenges with the chasm is we don't make those changes incrementally. We have to take some big steps. So part of the question that I have here is, how do we inform what those leaps are, and how do we build the courage and the direction to do that? And I think some of that has been coming from some of the other presentations. So I want to talk about what is strategy, how is strategy practiced, what is the gap. In fact, given the time that we have, I'm going to go relatively quickly over the first part, but I suggest that we don't go too fast. Joseph did a really nice job this morning talking about alternatives for strategy, and they do have impact on implementation. And you'll see that the history of strategy has a legacy of taking some very different approaches. And of course, one of the major challenges that we have is the organizations and their leaders oftentimes switch the approach that they take, and oftentimes not knowingly. So we'll look at some of the choices that we need to make there. So what is strategy? I teach MBA students. I teach a class called Strategic Decision Making. So we have our definition of strategy that academics have. We have definitions that consultants have. And we have the whole notion that if we have good strategy but good execution, we have good management. Unfortunately, when we see most of the statistics, we must not have good management. We have a process, and I'll just look at this quickly, that tells us kind of what is it, how do we make strategy, how do we teach our students to make strategy. We seem to approach it as a sequential process that goes through various steps, and it's there's a sense of, well, there's some kind of magic that happens at implementation, and yet I think that is the significant challenge that we have. So in terms of crafting strategy, this first part here is probably where we spend most of our time. What is the strategy? How do we go from a field that looks at future versus present, many versus few competitors, and make our choices? And we've got a history that goes all the way back to Alfred Chandler. My My looking at the kind of history of strategy is it really did grow out of operations management and planning, and strategy seemed to evolve out of that. So very much based on a technique, a recognition that we had bounded rationality in individuals, so we needed to address that in decision making, and that most of the decisions in strategy are non-programmable decisions. So not easy to do analysis and come up with the right answer, but important way to guide the organization. So we go from competitive strategy, the whole idea of positioning ourselves, to an adaptive view, Mintzberg's view of how strategy really happens, looking at cases. This would be territory that is in Vic's descriptive area. The notion of concentration, find a focus and compete there, and also the notion of the focus on execution is what wins. So the issue in this has been that leaders seem to switch their approaches to strategy, the focus of their organization, and thus present challenges for what happens. The other side of what I teach in this model is we just have to implement and execute the strategy. This is really what we're focused on here, and that implementation is really a question of how do we drive the organization to take the actions that we have designed it to do. And so most of my work is as an organizational sociologist, and what I have focused on is how do we design organizations to do a better job of achieving the outcomes that they desire. And so it really comes down to, this is the organization and leadership model that I use to teach here, the notion of how do you get from strategic intent to the organizational design to deliver that. And there we teach the various ways of looking at structure, alignment of structure. This is the congruence model that Bowman and Deal have developed and been teaching. It's also a major approach that's used by Nadler's consulting company. And the idea is there, if we just design the organization correctly, we would then be able to deliver the strategy. So the strategy implementation gap there is how do we get from the strategy to the design. And the last piece that I want to just cover, of course, is that we always have to measure our outcomes. We've heard quite a bit about measurement, but one of the insights that gives me is when we think about measurement and organizational effectiveness, we see that there are a variety of approaches that we can look at. Do we look at our resources? This goes back to the input, process, output model. Do we look at the internal process? Do we look at our outputs? Do we look at how we value strategic constituents? And that takes me back in some ways to some of the things that Hal was talking about this morning. And that is, what is our perspective? What is the question that we're asking rather than the answer that we're giving? So as I think about that in moving to strategy implementation and defining that territory, I go back to some work that was done by my mentor, Ed Schein, who studies culture and leadership. And his view on organizational learning was that the issue for organizational learning was that organizations were made up of very different occupational cultures. And that one of the great challenges in organizations being effective at working together was the understanding of these cultures with one another. And you'll see how this compares to the strategy implementation issue, because we have different constituents in those occupational cultures that play a role there. And without going into the specific details there, the three cultures that he observed that were persistent across the organizations he had worked with for probably 50 years was an operator subculture, those that run the local facilities, the engineering subculture, those that develop the technical capabilities of the organization, and the executive subculture, those that have oversight over the organization. Now, each of these have different sets of assumptions, different tools and practices that they use. So we see here in terms of how organizations manage themselves, we see that the engineering culture is the one that has the technical approach. They evaluate the organization's ability to convert skills and resources into goods and services efficiently. They tend to be the ones that use total quality, lean, Six Sigma, re-engineering as their kind of tools and methods. They are a culture that very much crosses between organizations and talks to each other. The internal systems approach, the operator culture, that's where we see organizational development, learning, innovation, team building, how we get people to work together. And the final one, the executive culture, is the one that does strategy, analysis, planning, finance, as a mechanism for engaging. And that culture, the interesting part of what Shine discovered about that culture is they are less connected to their organization than they are to other executives. So there's kind of this level of executive culture. And you saw that to a certain extent, I think, as Hal talked about people shifting and staying in that executive culture in some of the various organizations where we had them leading. The model of culture is that we see culture at different levels, mental models in terms of values and basic assumptions. And the challenge is that we have these three subcultures that have different understandings of the world, different perspectives that they see, and thus oftentimes don't talk to one another very well. So Shine's insight was that we need these cultures to be interacting and learning from one another to do better. And so I bring this here into my view of the challenge, which is I'm going to put the subcultures in that strategy to implementation gap that we have. We haven't really talked about this very much, that we have a part of the organization that tends to formulate strategy formulation unit. It's the CEO, the team, the top leaders. They then pass that strategy on to the implementation unit. So these are either the projects or programs, things that people talked about here, project management issues, cross-functional teams, or facilities and operators of those facilities. So the outcomes of the strategy tend to be the inputs of those people there, but if they are, in a sense, different cultures, then we have another way of thinking about an impedance mismatch, slightly different use of the word impedance than Vic had. So there's some challenges between plan change and emergent change, things that Patrick talked about that take place there. And I see that I have 1 minute and 30 seconds left. So these are the statistics here that we've seen from the Brightline economics people, economic intelligence unit people that tell us that it's a persistent problem. I think similar to what Patrick had said, 98% of strategy initiatives fail. It's because there is a big gap there. We can't teach managers to fly, so we need to build a bridge that takes us across that chasm, and that's what we're trying to do in the strategy implementation project. What I wanted to talk about in this presentation was how we overcome that bridge. Vic's talked about impedance factors and readiness. We have a number of different approaches to transitioning that. But what I want to say is that we've got some insights from systems theory. We have some insights from socio-technical systems. And we have some insights from organizational learning. So we are working on a practice of strategy implementation that draws upon the first principles from those areas, which I didn't take the time to explain, that looks at that specific space as a practice field. So why is it that plans get handed over? How can we create an environment where those people that are creating the strategy are actually testing, developing it, and getting feedback from those people that are doing the projects and implementing that? So we would use some ideas from organizational learning, managerial practice fields. We would look at what's an organizational architecture to enable learning in that strategy implementation process to give us results. I have a table of what are the guiding ideals, innovations in infrastructure, theory, tools, and methods that we would deploy in that. We've done this in the past in organizational learning settings with great success. We find that oftentimes as you put people together, they actually will undertake goals that are much higher than the ones that are set because they understand the value that can be captured. So a part of where we want to go with this is not teach managers to fly, not just build bridges, which are technical structures, but build these bridges with people to cross that strategy implementation gap. And our next step in this work here is that we're going to be putting together a workshop with managers there that we want to design some of their processes, these chief strategy officers. We want to help them design processes for delivering their strategy through socio-technical systems theory, and organizational learning practices to the constituents that would implement that, get fast feedback, and then take that to navigate the strategy implementation territory.
Thank you, George. So this morning, I think we recognize that, as you said, we're deliberately digging into what we believe is an area of potential research. And just from this very quick flyover, very rapid touch on, in some cases, fairly disparate research approaches, but we're beginning to see some boundaries. And the intent here is for you to carry this into lunch, carry this into the coffee breaks, can start having conversations about the different ways that you in your practitioner or research tradition may try to dig in and uncover these phenomenon, because that's the purpose of this seminar. So we'll have lunch. Lunch is going to be in the Sandberg Conference Center. It is just out and across the street. You'll see an entrance across and to the right, and follow the people in front of you. It's on the 6th floor. We will promptly come back here at, I'll say 1:20, 20 minutes after 1 o'clock, and start. And this afternoon, we're going to now shift, hopefully with some initial vocabulary and boundaries on the table. We're going to begin shifting a bit to a fair number of case studies to see if we can begin mapping some of these issues, some of these vocabularies and ontologies to real cases. So we'll see you at 1:20. Thank you.